Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I think we all agree that our immigration system is broken and that it needs to be fixed. Unfortunately, every time Congress has tried to fix our immigration system, promises of a more secure border are never upheld. And the bill we have in front of us today is following the same path as past immigration bills. Under this bill, it's certain that 12 million people in this country who are here illegally will receive legal status soon after the bill is enacted. However, the border security provisions of this bill are, again, nothing more than promises, which, again, may never be upheld. And I know that when I talk to the people that I represent in the state of South Dakota, one of the questions you get over and over again is, when is our federal government going to keep its promises when it comes to the issue of border security? And the second question is, why do we need more laws? Well, we're not enforcing the laws that we currently have on the books. Mr. President, it's time that we follow through on promises of a more secure border. And actually, you have to go back to 1996, which is the first time when Congress spoke on this issue. At that time, Congress stipulated that we needed to have a double and even triple-layered fence system on the border. Well, you roll time forward into 2006, 10 years later, the Secure Fence Act. Congress again passed a law requiring a double-layered fence, this time indicating very specific locations totaling around 850 miles, even above the current 700-mile requirement. Mr. President, 80 United States senators voted for that bill. Let me repeat that. 80 United States senators, Republicans and Democrats, in a bipartisan way, voted in 2006 under the Secure Fence Act for 850 miles of double-layered fence. Well, you go again forward to 2008 as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act. Congress specified this time that not less than 700 miles of fencing would be required. And to date, of course, of this requirement, only about 40 miles of the double-layered fence has been completed. During debate on the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act in 2010, an amendment was offered to require the completion of at least 700 miles of reinforced fencing along the southwest border, and this time with a specific timeline or specific date in mind, December 31st of 2010. That amendment was agreed to here on the Senate floor there were 54 votes in favor of it, including 21 Democrats, 13 of whom are still here today. But, Mr. President, the fence has still not been completed. Now, the amendment that I've offered, amendment number 1197, simply requires that we implement current law, completing 350 miles of double-layered fencing prior to RPI status being granted. The completion of this section of the fence would be a tangible, visible demonstration that we are serious about this issue of border security. After RPI status is granted, the remaining 350 miles required by current law would have to be constructed during the 10-year period before registered provisional immigrants can apply for green cards. So 350 miles before RPI status, 350 miles after. I think it's a reasonable way of approaching this issue. Now, people have gotten up and said, well, you can't, this fence is old school. It's not the only answer, Mr. President. It requires a combination of technology and manpower and surveillance, but there is an important place for infrastructure to play in this. And a double-layered fence, which was called for by Congress first in 1996, again in 2006, again in 2008, which there was broad bipartisan support for here in the United States Senate, should be something that we follow through on. One of the other issues that's been raised is, well, there's not money to do this. Well, there is money appropriated in this bill. $6.5 billion is appropriated, $1.5 billion of which is dedicated to infrastructure. Well, if you look at what it would cost to build a double-layered fence, the estimates are about $3.2 million per mile. So the 350 miles that we call for before RPI status is granted would run you in the range of $1 billion, sufficient within the money already allocated in the bill. But my point, Mr. President, very simply is this. We have made promises and commitments to the American people over and over and over again in a bipartisan way here in the United States Senate, which have not been followed through on. Now, the senator from Alabama who offered an amendment like this, very similar to this, at the Judiciary Committee markup, is here on the floor and been a leader in terms of trying to secure our borders, an issue that I think most Americans, before we deal with any other aspect or element of the immigration debate, believe ought to be addressed. And I would just simply ask him, and Mr. President, if I might through the chair, because do you think that building 40 miles out of a 700-mile requirement is keeping the promise that we've made to build a border fence that's adequate to deter illegal crossings? And secondly, doesn't infrastructure, such as a double-layered fence, enhance the effectiveness of border control agents and surveillance technologies along the border, recognizing again, it's not the only answer. It is combined with, complemented by other forms of border security. But it is important, in my view, Mr. President, that we have a visible, tangible way in which we make it very clear that this is a deterrent to people coming to this country illegally. We want people to come here legally. We are a welcoming nation. We are a nation of immigrants, but we're a nation of laws, and we have got to enforce the laws. We have not been doing that, and we have not been keeping the promises that we made to the American people when it comes to border security, and more specifically when it comes to the building of the fence. And so I would ask my colleague through the chair from Alabama about his views on this and whether or not we have followed through on a level that is anywhere consistent with what we promised to the American people. And secondly, don't you think that this infrastructure component is an important element when it comes to the border security part of this debate on immigration reform? And I would just say, Mr. President, to my colleague from Alabama, and again, thank him for his leadership on this issue, both past and present, that what we are talking about here is something that is a part of a solution. This isn't the totality. This isn't the entirety. People have come down here and said, well, you can't just build a fence. People will tunnel under it. They'll climb over it. Of course they will. But coupled with additional Border Patrol agents, coupled with surveillance, coupled with modern technologies, it is a composite solution, if you will. But it still very clearly is a deterrent. It is a visible, tangible message and deterrent that we want people to come to this country legally. We want to discourage illegal immigration. The fence, I think, is part of the infrastructure component of that border security solution, and it's something that we've all made commitments on in the past. And I think it's very hard to ask people to vote for an immigration reform bill that includes the legalization component to it if we're not going to follow through on the promises that we've made, because the American people have heard this before. Promises is something they've heard plenty of in the past when it comes to this issue. We have yet to follow through on this, with the exception of the 36 miles, as I mentioned, that's been built. But commitments were made in 1996 and requirements to do this in 2006. As you said, in 2008, the money was added. That was a 76-17 vote here in the United States Senate. 76 United States senators from both parties voted to fund this in 2008. And in 2006, 80 United States senators, including now President Obama, who at that time was a senator, now Vice President Biden, who at that time was a senator, and at that time Senator Hillary Clinton, all voted for the Secure Fence Act in 2006. So again, I'm not suggesting for a minute that it is the only solution, the cure-all, the panacea that's going to address this issue. But I think it is something that is very, very real, very tangible, very visible. It is something that we have made a commitment on to the American people, and I think it's something that we ought to follow through on. And it certainly ought to be a requirement, a condition, if you will, in this legislation before some of these other elements come to pass. Because if it's not, it will never get done, as we've already seen, going back to 1996. And so I hope that Amendment 1197, when it's voted on this afternoon, that we will have the same strong bipartisan support that we've had in the past on this issue. And I hope again that, as a senator from Alabama and I have pointed out, that we will follow through on a commitment that we've made to the American people and do something really meaningful on the issue of border security. And I would just say in closing, Mr. President, again, that this is not, the border is 2,000 miles long. This requires 700 miles. And so it would be put in those areas where, as the senator from Alabama noted, it is most needed. And Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor, and I would ask when the time comes for support on Amendment 1197.